So I wanted to start with a little background on why I chose to try to tackle a topic like this. I have to confess right up front, I am not an expert, I am not a historian, I'm not a researcher. I approached the writing in the story the way I would approach writing a newspaper article or a magazine. I went to experts and for information. I just want to make it clear right up front that I'm not the expert. I talk to experts in trying to put this story together. And there are a few different strands that sort of went into the idea. The idea grew over time. And I will go back to my mom, who was a teacher at Nauset Regional Middle School. And she worked in the 8th grade. And she would come home so distraught year in, year out when they got to particular moments in the social studies curriculum. And for years, I'll talk a little more about this as we move forward. For years, the curriculum in middle school covered early U.S. history, colonization, 1619, Jamestown, what happened there, moving through to the Civil War. And my mother it was a perennial thing, she would come home and she would have a yearly rant about how much it bothered her that slavery, that the people of African descent who came to this country were only ever talked about within the context of slavery, within the context of the Civil War. All worthy topics, certainly, when you're learning history and social studies, but it bothered her that people did not recognize, and in classrooms it wasn't recognized, that side by side our story, founding fathers, were all of these people, Native people, people of African descent, who were working alongside people to build the nation. So there was my mom. That was a common from throughout my childhood. And then more recently, much more recently, I started working in middle school, and I'm happy to say that changes have been made in curricula. Social studies, up until about 4 or 5 years ago, was still covering the same parts of history, but the telling is getting much more factual, more honest. This is why I chose this picture, if I didn't see why, it's because I think I can pretty, except for Phoebe back there, maybe say most of us in the room grew up with the same, like, trace your hand, make the turkey, this New England image of Thanksgiving. And I have to say that things are getting more factual and more inclusive. And so anyway, it was the summer of all of the Black Lives Matter protests, and just at the school we were talking about how do we come back to school after this summer? How do we come back to our students and reflect and acknowledge what happened this summer? And I attended a conference with American University, and it was a panel of African-American authors, teachers, who were talking to teachers about what do we do. And one of the things, and it sort of resonated with me because it sounded a lot like my mom, is a lot of people talked about the anger that we had seen that summer, but the need to not always talk about the story within the context of the trauma, which was very real, the horror of slavery, but also to just have stories for children where protagonists are people of underrepresented communities of people, and that's not the story. That's just the characters. So that was another thing that sort of wove into my thinking, my mother's voice. And then I attended an NEH National Endowment for the Humanities Conference for Teachers and met a gentleman, and I'm sorry to say I can't remember his name, I should have looked that up. But he was a teacher and he was developing curriculum for Connecticut. I believe it's Connecticut, maybe Rhode Island. Anyway, south of us. He had discovered a lot of primary sources. It was the seminar that day was on using primary sources in the classroom, but he had discovered a lot of primary source materials that were about people who were enslaved in communities. Some of the sources, one was really interesting. It was about a board of selectmen trying to decide what to do with a person who was enslaved who had been given to the town to pay a debt on property taxes. And there were just bills of sale, wills, and he was using those, and it was really astounding for the children and for him. The more he looked, the more he found. And after that I was like, I wonder about the Cape. So I just started rummaging around. And then I came up with the idea of creating a guidebook to take people around the Cape armed with new knowledge, to think about people who were here who were unremembered. And they were intentionally unremembered. Or maybe not, even worse. Maybe they just weren't even included because they weren't thought to be worth including in the pages of history. So I set out to try to find the name of one person in each town on the Cape who had been enslaved here. I found many people, and there were more. So anyway, we're going to move on. I'm going to see, I said I would ramble, and I just had to remind me if I start to go off, down rabbit holes, say push the button, and that will keep me, hopefully, on track. So, here's the little background. I gave you that on why I decided to write the book. One last thing is, throughout my many years, I worked for the Cape Cod for years. I was a senior writer, and I don't want to offend anyone, but I'm going to say it's back when it was a newspaper. I think, is it even alive still?
No. Yes.
It is. It's pretty much, I think, an advertising tool now. But this was back in the day when every town, every reporter lived in the town they covered. Old Mel Hobbs was there, John Ullman, I don't know if any of you remember John, and he would bang out a typewritten editorial every week, and if the typewriter ran out of ribbon, it was horrible because nobody used manual typewriters anymore, and it would, stop the presses. But one of the things I've always loved about writing features about people on Cape Cod is incorporating the landscape, because we all know this place, and it has touched generations of people. Everyone who has come here has been touched by this place. And while there's an awful lot we can't know about the people who were enslaved living here, we know what it is to live here. We know the beauty of this place. So I wanted to create a book where I really tried to honor the landscape as a home for people that were unremembered. So I'm going to read a little bit about that. It's the prologue about my approach to writing, and landscape actually plays a big part in most everything I write. This is a prologue that I wrote that explains my approach to landscape. So, resonance from past events lies in the landscape we inhabit. We can feel that echo, hear it if we try. At least I believe we can. I love the word resonance. It's one that sounds like what it means. Most folks associate resonance with the timbre of sound, for example, the depth and emotional texture of your grandmother's voice, the longing in the cry of a mourning dove cooing to her mate, or the heaving breath of the ocean. In all the talk, rustles, thunders, whispers, and sighs around us, there is a depth of sound. That is the resonance of the past in the landscape. Landscapes speak to us if we're willing to listen. Listening and hearing are different. First, we hear. We're always hearing something, our own thoughts that might pull us from the voices of those around us, the stories of those around us that, for a moment, might drown out our own thoughts. There is hearing, but then there is listening. Listening has intention, and if we stop to listen, the landscape has stories to tell. There are the winding bits of stone wall, wending their way through space where the need for walls has long since passed. Broken remnants of buildings, graffiti covered, startling, might loom in places where there is otherwise nothing. The ocean, with her never-ending push and pull, both buries and reveals our stories. After scraping away the sands, beds of peat crisscrossed with wagon tracks are revealed. A midden is uncovered on a construction site. You all know what a midden is, right? It's like a trash heap of shells left behind from people, native people who lived here. And when you find one on a construction site, everything grounds to a halt. We recognize the kinds of trees surrounding us, what they replaced, and why the others disappeared. The fertility of the soil on which we stand, or its barrenness, has a story too, as do the rivers that run through it all, or not, and the proximity to oceans, or not. Everything around us tells us how we got here. And so, we can stand in places and hear the traffic passing, the plane overhead, the wind in the trees, and the voices of nearby neighbors, and let it go at that. Or, we can truly and openly be in places, notice and listen to the stories each tells, and feel the resonance of the past. In these pages, the resonance to which I refer is the noticing of what is resonant, then the reflection about the prolongation of a lingering vibration left by the past. This book is about going to places armed with knowledge, standing in each and coming full circle to be aware of the sounds and smells, the sky and the distant sound of the ocean, but to do so standing in someone else's shoes. At the end of each chapter, a number of locations are given. Each has a brief overview, and each is just one of many spots where people can contemplate and honor the existence of those who were unremembered. So that's sort of that was a really, elemental part of the writing, is I wanted to think a lot about the landscape and how it drew people here, how it has sustained people, the work that was dictated by our days here, because trying to flesh out the lives of people that long ago, we were talking earlier, Mark, about, just people who want to know more about what ancestors' lives were like. It's really challenging. Back in the colonial times, it's difficult to put that together. But we know the landscape here. We know what a northeaster feels like. We know what winter storm is like and what it can do to your life here. So anyway, in my learning and in teaching, and there's a lot going on with evolving attitudes, and I think, and I'm happy to say, evolving attitudes. I don't know if a lot of you know, don't try to read these, they're very difficult, but you know, are you all Eastham folks, or some of you visiting, or? So if you're an Eastham person, you might know this, the tale of the two plaques down at First Encounter. So we have, my initial NC Wyeth image, we have this notion of the first encounter, so in the 1920s, a plaque was put up on a stone, and it was the inscription on the first memorial read, "On this spot, hostile Indians had their first encounter December 8, 1620, old style, with Miles Standish, John Carver, William Bradford, John Tilley," goes through the names. I don't know what the old style means, it kind of...
It's the date.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay, I thought it was, I pictured an old picture show or something, like it was an old, old style encounter. And then in 2001, a new plaque was erected And it says, near this site, the Nauset tribe of the Wampanoag Nation, seeking to protect themselves and their culture, had their first encounter. And it goes on with them. And so we see a much more realistic look at what happened on that place. So I know I'm going to try to stick to my program here and not wander. So this was, as I mentioned, kids got sort of clobbered with this, 200 some odd years of history, the arrival of the Pilgrims, the American Revolution, Civil War, Westward expansion, and it just kind of, it feels the way it's taught like it happened really quickly, but it's not. It was hundreds of years, and it's taking us hundreds of years to kind of adapt and come back to a more accurate telling. So clearly, in schoolrooms across New England, there are more accurate tellings and the stories of colonization across the globe, North American British colonies that became the United States. And it's a process, and I think we're getting better at it. But relating facts that don't jive with the comfortable, familiar histories, stories that to some extent have become a kind of creation myth, creates incongruity, and it creates discomfort. So if we have this wonderful, warm and fuzzy image of our founding and our history, and then we're hit with new information that really contradicts what we grew up with, what we believed, it's hard. And what do we do with that? I thought about that summer after the Black Lives Matter riots, and there was a lot of tearing down of monuments, and I have to be honest, and I hope I don't offend people saying this, but I really feel like tearing down monuments, tearing out pages of history books, however inaccurately written, maybe it's at my teacherness, I would much rather have statues with additions to statues, with commentary, history, taught in a way that this is how we taught, but this is what we know now, and we know how inaccurate that was. But it's hard, because people get upset. So how do we comfortably and respectfully reconcile things? And I had a Sergeant Joe Friday, a dragman, and said, just the facts, man. However, in looking up, who said that? Because I thought it was Superman, actually, talking to Lois Lane, but found out it was Joe. But then it might not have been Joe, but that's who it's attributed to. But when I was talking to people up at the Nye Museum up in Sandwich, I was doing some photography and research up there, and it was interesting because they asked if I would stay and talk a little after about the book and about what I was trying to find, and they kept saying, how are you going to talk about this? And I was like, I'm just going to tell the facts, which really good reporting should be just telling facts. And if you just tell the facts, it's impartial, right? So, but it's still hard. And so many of us, particularly people of my age, believe, and many people still believe, just talking to people about the topic of this book, get stunned responses to the fact that there are people who are enslaved living in the North. Because if you grew up in my time, you grew up with the North were the good guys, the South were the bad guys, and that's how it was. And that is just not accurate. So as I started digging around, as I said, I looked for one person in each community, and I found many. And here are just some facts that challenged the understanding that the South they were the good guys, the North were the good guys, South were the bad guys. Pilgrims' colonization of Plymouth was underwritten by the merchant adventurers, and the Pilgrims had found acceptance of a place to live where they could, practice their faith in Amsterdam. But they wanted to retain their British identity. They wanted their children to grow up to be British citizens. And so they wanted to carve out a life and fortune for themselves. So they came here, and it was as much a financial endeavor as it was in search of a place to practice their faith. And it wasn't about religious freedom, because they enslaved Quakers, or if they didn't kill them for not practicing the correct faith. So Massachusetts was the first colony to legalize the practice of slavery, and correspondence between early colonial leaders and business people advocated the use of Moors as more cost-effective and practical than people who were native to this region. So I think this is becoming more common knowledge, especially on the Cape, but there were many people, well, not just on the Cape, in New England, many people who were indigenous, native people, and they were at first enslaved, but then it became apparent that it was really wiser to use people who were not native to the region, who didn't know the area, which made escape easier. And so they would trade people who were indigenous for people that were trafficked from Africa. And in 1640-something, the ship Desire, which was captained by the same captain who brought subsequent pilgrims over, not the Mayflower, but the Anne was a ship that came after with more people to the Plymouth colony. And he captained the first boat out of Boston that took native people and to the West Indies, to the Caribbean, and traded them for people of African descent and brought them back to the area. And really, that's one of the beginning footsteps in what developed into the triangle trade that we all learn about. New England enslavers' uses for people that they trafficked and enslaved were different from Caribbean and Southern plantations. It wasn't unusual for New Englanders to enslave people, and that's just, but they didn't have huge plantations, so they didn't need a lot of people. But most households had people who were enslaved. I know there were a lot of indentured people here, too. I had a historian, tell me that I was mistaken looking for enslaved people, that here in the North we did indentured servitude, and that people weren't enslaved forever. But it was not, the people were trained to do particular jobs, and they, like glass blowing or blacksmithing, or and people enslaved in New England also did household work, but the people who had specialized skills were often rented out to other people who needed those skills. So it was a way of making money that way. So I have some documents here, and I'm not going to try to, you can see what they look like. I transcribed some of them, but you can see that here we have a guy, a rope maker in Plymouth, and he purchased a young woman from Jonathan born in Sandwich, and her name was Jean, and she was 22 years of age. For a slave during her natural life, so she was transferred, ownership of her was transferred, and he said he believed she was healthy. Other than being pregnant, he couldn't see anything wrong with her. So this here, these are some Brewster. This is from, you can see Benjamin Bangs, and Bangs is a big Cape Cod name, and many of us know it. And there was a transfer of Harry, and there was little Molly, and so, as I said, one of the challenges in researching was the boundaries of towns have changed. So what was once Harwich is now Brewster. So when I laid out the book town by town, the records might have said Harwich, but it's geographically what's on the Cape today. This is an interesting story about Ephraim Swift placed an ad in a newspaper about a runaway, and this was in 1761, and this Peter, 27 or 28 years old, spoke good English, ran away wearing I don't know what a beaverette hat is. Does anyone know? I picture like a top hat, maybe. Green worsted cape, closed body coat, so he was clearly like wearing his belongings to escape. $5 reward, and don't. It says that anyone tempted to conceal this person should beware. So I took some kids on a field trip up to Barnstable. There's a farm up there. They have 18 acres out to the Great Marsh, and the kids were sort of running ahead of us, and myself and the people who owned the farm and another teacher were walking along talking. And I said to the man that I had this book coming out, and it starts with the Great Marsh and how it drew people to the Cape because it was ready feed for livestock, and so people, and he said, "That's crazy." And I was like, "I know," but that wasn't, it wasn't what I was saying, telling him that he found crazy, but the fact that someone had just shown up on his property asking if the family minded if he could use his metal detector, because on the Upper Cape he was finding slave tags. And these were the tags that, at least here in the north, and these are not necessarily northern ones, I was just showing some images of what they looked like, but they had sometimes just a number, sometimes a name, but the person's specialty, and of what they, so if it was a blacksmith or a seamstress or and when you could readily see what these people could offer for your, if you needed, help with certain specialties. So I thought that was interesting, and when you think of the landscape, and here we have been walking over these slave tags, for how long, I don't know, for generations. But they're here, and they have a story to tell. This is the document about Jean's sale that I read portions of to you. This is up in Plymouth at the Pilgrim Hall Museum, and this is a bill of sale for a young woman named Sabina and Joseph Lord, who founded the first Congregational church in Chatham. First of all, he was ordained at Harvard. His family lived in Dorchester. He was sent forth from Dorchester to the Carolinas and to found a church there. So on the Ashley River, just outside of Charleston, he founded a town called Dorchester, and started a church there. And after about 20 years, he came north and came to Chatham and founded the first Congregational church, or helped. There was a handful of people trying to get a church up and running, and he became their minister. But he gave his daughter Sabina, and Sabina was, her mother was South African Indian, and her father was a Negro, it says in there. And which is interesting. It makes me think that perhaps Sabina came from South Carolina then, because so many people, most enslaved people, the majority of enslaved people out of the many millions, went to South America and to the islands in the Caribbean, to plantations. So it makes kind of sense that she may have come north with them. So Joseph Lord gave his daughter Mercy, Mercy married one of the Taylors, good old Cape Cod name again, and when her husband died, I assume she had ownership. Again, she sold Sabina to the Bourne family. There were a lot of Bournes, and he was a solicitor in Barnstable. And so it's interesting because she, not very often can you sort of trace a person through various families and places, so that was an interesting story. This I thought was really interesting because I started this back and probably started looking and researching and reading and talking to people back in 21, 22, and this was not there then because I did a lot of research on Ancestry and Wikitree, and because you see a lot of wills there, and that's a place to find information. And a lot of wills, you know, right next to things like, you know, my silver, my saddle, my Negro, my slave, my, you know, just in the lineup of things bequeathed to people or other people. But this is really interesting because people clearly are starting to make note of this, and there is on Wikitree now families who enslaved people in Barnstable County. So that certainly flies in the face of my understanding growing up that there wasn't slavery in the North, that was just a bad thing in the South. So I thought that was quite interesting, and hopefully for those of you who are interested in researching and doing family genealogy, you'll add to resources and documents like this.
Susanna?
Yes.
The thing that you just showed is that each of those families owned slaves. Wow.
Yeah.
Through the alphabet.
Yeah. And I'm sure, you know, they're looking through it. Some of the people that I found were not on this list. So, you know, I'm sure it's not 100%. And people, they may never have been made note of. You know, just it's difficult to tell. So anyway, it's not a matter of if people were enslaved here. People from Africa and their descendants were absolutely here on the Cape and across New England. The lower number of people enslaved here prior to the Revolutionary War was not dictated by anti-slavery sentiments, nor were anti-slavery sentiments at the heart of laws abolishing slavery in northern states. I just wanted to read, another little snippet, which again just surprised me. So moving into the latter half of the 18th century, as people increasingly pointed out the absurdity of enslavement existing alongside calls for liberty and equality, Massachusetts became the first to abolish slavery completely. Other states, Vermont and Pennsylvania, for example, had successfully begun a phased approach to abolition earlier. Like underlying factors of the Civil War, this measure was as much pragmatic and political as it was moral. So there was, I gotta find this guy's name, it's on this guy's page. In response, a lot of our forefathers with familiar names responded to the request for information in, what is this guy's name? Sorry, I had it marked, but. So, years after Massachusetts made slavery illegal, John Adams argued that the real justification for the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts had in fact been driven by the growing number of working white people, quote, who would no longer suffer the rich to employ these sable rivals so much to their injury, and that if the gentleman versus a working class had been permitted to, by law, to hold slaves, he said, the common white people would have put the Negroes to death, and their masters too, perhaps. White laborers, scoffing at and insulting, filled the Negroes with discontent, making them wholly useless to their masters to such a degree that the abolition of slavery became a measure of economy. Adams' comments were made in response to a request from Judge St. George Tucker of Virginia, who wrote to Jeremy Belknap of Boston. Tucker, a law professor at the College of William and Mary, asked Belknap to gather comments in an effort to learn how Massachusetts had achieved abolition so peacefully. Belknap passed the letters on to a number of the Commonwealth leaders, and they answered. In the same series of letters, James Winthrop wrote a response for Belknap in 1795. After outlining the various steps toward abolition the state had taken, he noted, "I do not recollect anything further on this subject, but I cannot forbear adding that it would be more worthy of an enlightened legislature to regulate a trade that is woven into our nature and has been carried on and considered as lawful from the earliest antiquity than try to abolish it. If abuses have crept in, they should be guarded against, but abuse alone will not justify abolishing a trade which manifestly tends to preserve life and increase the quantity of productive labor in the whole world." So, again, the story, was that it was a fight in moral terms, but not necessarily. It was about getting votes, it was financial, it was appeasing the voters. And so a number of researchers and organizations have estimated the people who were enslaved were responsible for 222 million hours of labor given to the building of their enslavers' wealth and to the successful construction of this nation. So, I'm sorry, I tend to ramble, and as I said, I'm not an expert. I'm not a historian. I'm someone who believes that we need to start having conversations, being able to have conversations. I hope in the book that there are topics for discussion that we can, just talk to one another respectfully and openly and acknowledge that things were not maybe necessarily what we believe them to be, and to talk about this history and to talk about how this history is taught and how do we change what we were taught, change our understanding of that. We have to be able to, that's what the whole concept of embracing incongruity is, because there is a great deal of discomfort in the work that we have to do. And, I don't have easy answers, but I can just tell, yes, sorry.
Here, I was wondering what you discovered about Eastham as you were writing this book.
Yeah, so Eastham was a little confusing because, again, boundaries have changed. And John Kendrick, I believe it was John, there are a number of Kendricks on the Cape, and John Kendrick of Eastham owned property from, I think, Truro right on down through Harwich, if not further. And so it's funny, I was thinking, I'm actually making some corrections as I learn, and I do think that, I don't know if it's the same Kendrick, but there was a gentleman in the South Orleans region, and at the time of his death, he enslaved 8 people, and 7 or 8 people, and then there was another Kendrick, Jonathan, I think, who went away to war, but he enslaved 2 people, and the way they talk about them, it sounded to me as if they might have been married, and he talked about, upon his death and his will, that they would be freed and the family would set them up with cattle, home. So if it's the same person, he enslaved many people, the same Kendrick. If it's just the one person here geographically in this area, there were 2. But again, my goal in writing was to find one name that I could attach to each chapter, and then in each chapter I talk about different historical aspects of slavery in New England. All I'm asking us to do is to ask questions and have conversations and look for answers, because people were unremembered, you know, they weren't forgotten, they were unremembered. And when I love this, I'm so excited, when they designed this, but if you look at the cover of the book and you tilt it a little, I don't think you can see it from there, but the names of the people on the Cape, all of the names of people I found are now on the cover of this book. So people who were left out of the pages of history now are here. But I think the more we can find their names, the more we can say their names. That sounds like, I don't know, kind of cliche and hokey almost, but I just feel as though there's a lot we can't do. It makes me think of when family members pass away and they're not there anymore to ask. You know, you can't fill in the holes in histories. So little was left of people, but if we can find their names, if we can put them in the record, you know, of the people who built these successful communities and towns that have grown into a nation. So I think we have to find ways and to talk about people and to talk about our feelings and to talk about, you can't undo it, but you can certainly tell the truth and acknowledge our history. So that's what I'm trying to do. I just wanted to close quickly, a forward for the book, and I think it really is lovely. Folklore, which comes from historical facts and is passed down through storytelling, has often been ignored by historians who did not want to leave a reminder of the less than pleasant facts of Cape Cod's history. As a segment of society has attempted to eliminate history to reflect an artificial representation of culture, brave women and men have taken up the torch to write more inclusive and often less savory accounts of our past. This book is a small piece of that history. Susanna has taken the time and care to preserve some of this folklore hidden in documents, resources, and public records. This book is dense with information and requires multiple reads to fully absorb. I found myself stopping to reflect on the stories I heard as a child, stories my classmates did not hear because their knowledge was shaped by an agenda meant to hide the less savory parts of Cape Cod history.